Welcome back. Panelists here. Joshua Johnson, host of 1A on NPR. Danielle Pletka of the American Enterprise Institute. NBC News national political correspondent Heidi Przybylov. And Peter Baker, the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. All right. There's two ways to look at these shutdown proposals. One is it's going nowhere, Peter Baker. The other is, Mark Warner said there, okay, I'm willing to accept the president as a starting point. He made an inch towards the Democrats. Democrats made an inch toward, it's not half full, but there's condensation in the water, in the glass.
For 29 days, all we had was give me the money or don't give me the money. It was just one thing on the table. Neither side was budging. Now we're starting to put some other things on the table. We're expanding the problem so that there, in fact, can be multiple aspects to it to give each side something that they can live with. You can see the makings of a deal here. Now, you're right. At the moment, it doesn't seem like it's likely to happen in the next 24, 48 hours. They're still stuck on, I'm not going to negotiate on this, I'm not going to negotiate on that. And if the president really wanted a deal, I'm not sure coming out on television to make the first proposal is the way to do it. I'm not sure that rejecting it before it was made is the way to do it. But you can see the beginnings of negotiation. We're now in a place where people are actually beginning to move.
So here's what happened. Basically, Jared Kushner and Mike Pence were up on the Hill this week. They met with Mitch McConnell. They left. Mitch McConnell picked up the phone and called the president and said, Mr. President, Nancy Pelosi is not going to budge. You've got to do something to shake this up. Just put something on the table. And so this is wholly a proposal from the White House. And that is the problem, however, is that even though we saw some movement in terms of the wall itself, the president conceding for the first time, this is not a contiguous wall, also giving a little bit on DACA. It is not anywhere close to what the Democrats would want in terms of the money being directed towards the infrastructure that's needed at ports of entry, drones, more people on the border. There is some stuff on there in terms of more increased border security that's not wall, but they're still far apart on the specifics. And here's the most important thing, and you heard Mark Warner say this, according to the Democrats who I talked to, is they really are going to stay united when it comes to the principle of this negotiation taking place when the government is open and not closed.
Interesting. Well, close? No? You don't see progress?
Don't look at me. I don't know.
Yeah?
Nope. And let's be clear, no one in this room knows when the shutdown's going to end.
Fair enough.
Let's just knock that right out. There's no clear path, and I think part of the reason is because this is no longer purely pragmatic or practical politics. This is a moral issue. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the shutdown is kind of a symptom of something larger. The wall is a campaign promise the president made to play on something very deeply held that his political base feels. And if you want to look for an image that actually speaks to this, it's probably those protesters who were on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the Native American man who was beating the drum, Nathan Phillips, and those kids in the Make America Great Again hats that were kind of smirking at him and kind of looking down their noses at him. To me, that is the real image. That is the real emblem of this. This is about xenophobia. For many Americans, this is about race. This is about rhetoric that has reached a point where it has ground the government to a halt. Nancy Pelosi said a wall is an immorality. So how do you make a political solution to a moral quandary? It seems like the entire political establishment has kind of painted itself into a place where the practical nature of politics could solve this. But for many Americans, for many people of color, and I'm not speaking for all people of color, for the Rashida Tlaibs in this country, for the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes in this country, they are tired of political solutions to moral problems.
You know, Danny, it's interesting. He brought up the perhaps the box that Democrats have painted themselves in, the morality. Then you have the A word when it comes to the right, which is amnesty, which is that any little protection for anybody that's not here legally is somehow amnesty. And the president tweeted this morning: no, amnesty is not part of my offer. It is a 3-year extension of DACA. Amnesty will be used only on a much bigger deal, whether on immigration or something else. Likewise, there will be no big push to remove the 11 million plus people who are here illegally. But be careful, Nancy. The amnesty word. We know that suddenly can splinter the right.
So there's a lot of history behind these immigration problems. It's not just something that came up between Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi. This goes back to 1986 and the original deal that was struck with the Reagan administration, which most people don't even remember, and that was the amnesty question. You know, I think what we've seen is that while Donald Trump had painted himself into a corner, the reality is we may not like it, we may not agree with him, but he has moved. And it is a mistake on the part of the speaker to come out of the box and not accept the idea that we like the idea of a 3-year extension. Sure, we want to do better. We could accept a 700-mile or so border, a fence. The Democrats, every sitting Democrat in the Senate, voted for just such a thing a mere 5 years ago. The problem that you have is when you start suggesting that anyone who wants a wall is, or no, not many, I don't want to be unfair to you, but that many who want this are actually racists, it causes a real hardening on the other side. There are plenty of people, including 35-plus Democratic senators, who wanted a wall, signed up to a wall, and who I don't think are racists.
Bottom line is, if you take the emotion out of this debate, it's solved tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think Justice's point is exactly right, which is what used to be a relatively pragmatic discussion about a little of this, a little of that, right? In 2006, Republicans, along with many Democrats, voted for the Secure Fence Act. They put in 650 miles worth of fencing. Today, it has become a moral issue on both sides in different ways. Very hard to meet in the middle.
I want to be clear, there are some experts who do believe that there are certain kinds of barriers in certain parts of the border that make perfect sense. We interviewed a Border Patrol expert on our program who said that especially in urban areas where there are plenty of places for smugglers to kind of duck and dodge behind buildings or down alleys, physical barriers can make a real difference in terms of securing the border. So saying it's inherently an immorality may be true in some people's hearts, but there are pragmatic ways in which certain kinds of barriers along certain parts of the border have helped.
There's a deal to be had. It's not going to be had, according to the Democrats, when the government is closed, because just this week you saw other groups, other conservative-based groups, pro-life groups, say, let's have a shutdown over Planned Parenthood funding. And so this really is, for Democrats, about the principle.
If this continues to go on, which party is more vulnerable to seeing more splintering off here? Right? I mean, I feel like you've got those Trump House Democrats, you've got those Senate Republicans in blue states. It seems like they're both wobbly here.
I think right now Nancy Pelosi is at more risk because she's facing exactly what two Republican speakers faced up to, which is her own version of the Freedom Caucus, her own version of the Tea Party, who are going to turn on her like vipers.
I think Mitch McConnell's move here with getting Trump to make this proposal was also meant to move this to the Senate. So I would look to those Senate Democrats, those moderate Democrats, which is why I reached out to Joe Manchin last night. And he gave a very kind of nebulous statement. But it did say, let's open the government, which brings me back to the same point I keep making.
Right. and as you heard Mark Warner there, maybe we could pay him. You could tell there's some movement. All right. Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and then click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.